Okay, welcome back. Trust you enjoyed your lunch. We've got a few people still coming back in from lunch, but we're going to push on. We're packing a lot into the suitcase today. In AFL parlance, if this day was a match, we've just come out of halftime. We're going into the third quarter, which lovers of AFL football will know is referred to as the premiership quarter. This is where games are won or lost. If it was the good old days, I could give you a right royal spray now and drop a few F-bombs and tell everyone to lift their game, but it's modern day 2025, so I have to talk as a modern day coach and say we all just love each other and we're here together, moving in the right direction, and what's important is that we all have a fun time and everyone gets a ribbon for turning up. So, however, what have you chosen to do now? A fascinating discussion we've got planned. Paul Holmes yesterday from Legal Aid Queensland, if you were here you might remember, made a great point that in times of real adversity, he's seen Australian communities come together in a way that continues to inspire him. Well, now we ask, what's the role of banks in times of crises? A different type of first response is the title of this conversation. It's going to feature Kate Fowler, who's the Head of Customer and Business Assist at Westpac, Louise Hayes, who's the National Coordinator for Disaster Recovery for the Financial Counselling Australia, and Caroline Wall, who's CBA's Head of Customer Vulnerability, are being joined by Melanie Preziuso, my apologies, Melanie, Associate Partner at EY, to steer this conversation. It's all yours, Melanie. Get the panel up here. Let's have a round of applause and let's talk disaster response. Oh, I got it so right earlier, then I sort of got it right, then I got it right.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us after lunch. We're very pleased to be joining you for this really important discussion. I'd like to begin though by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome our panel, Kate Fowler, Louise Hayes and Caroline Wall, who each bring a wealth of experience, dedication and a unique perspective to this really important topic. And it is an important topic. It's important because it's about the role of banks in our society and how that's evolving. And I think it really builds on a theme that has come through a number of the conversations over yesterday and today. What we'll explore in this panel is the critical role that banks, and in particular frontline staff, are starting to play in the context of being supporting customers during times of uncertainty and in crisis, and as a type of first response. What we know is whether a customer is fleeing domestic violence, experiencing Sorry, I thought I heard someone say something. Whether that's a person fleeing domestic violence, whether they're seeking support during a natural disaster, and or where they might be an older person who's experiencing financial abuse, or someone just experiencing a sudden life event. Typically, it's our banks who are some of the first ports of call for people when they're seeking support and assistance. So what we're looking to discuss today and bring to life for you really is how banks are navigating this emerging expectation, and also how they're preparing their people, processes and products to meet the emerging needs. So in welcoming my panel, I would like to first open with a question to each of the panel members, and if you could, I'd just be interested in if each of you could provide your perspectives on how you see the role of banks evolving when it comes to supporting customers during a crisis or time of uncertainty. And I might start with Kate.
Perfect. Afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I think we've had a lot of credits in the bank post-COVID, with customers knowing that they can come to the banks for support, which I think is amazing. For us, it does extend, far greater than just the financial traction, transactions that we complete on behalf of a customer. We recognise we play a big role in many of our customers' lives in the moments that are often the most critical to them, whether it's a marriage breakup, whether it's a natural disaster or something as significant as abuse, whether it's domestic or family violence or elder abuse. And so for us, the support we give in those moments is, a privilege on our behalf to be able to provide it. And it's something that we continue to evolve. And I don't think we've got an answer on everything that's yet to come, but I think we've got a well progressed solutions box that can actually support customers in those really critical moments.
Thanks, Kate. Louise.
Thanks, Mel. I think in the sort of sector of natural disasters, the banks have evolved quite a lot in recent years. And with the increasing frequency of natural disasters, and there's been 25 declared natural disasters since the beginning of this year alone, that the role of banks is no longer really just a service provider. They're an integral part in actually helping their customers recover. And I think, customers aren't looking just for that sort of immediate relief. They're also looking for empathy, they're looking for flexibility, and they're looking for practicalities. And I think we're really seeing that in the banking sector, certainly in the immediacy of a disaster. And I think the other thing that is starting to evolve is actually how banks respond. The way you respond to customers who have gone through that traumatic event makes a huge difference on that person and how they recover and how they make their way through that journey after the disaster. So yeah, it's a really critical role that banks are now playing, and we're really seeing them step up.
Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a change in the way that banks are being perceived by the community, not just as financial institutions, but really as a critical touch point in times of crisis. We often see banks being the first place that people will go when they are experiencing crisis, especially something like family and domestic violence. And it also shows, I think, a shift in a societal understanding of just how intertwined things like financial abuse and physical safety are. We find that in about 90% of cases of family and domestic violence, there is also financial abuse present. And it's one of the most prevalent ways that perpetrators can keep victims trapped in an abusive relationship. And often, as I say, the bank is the first place that someone will go when they are seeking support, because you need money to leave. And so I think it's critical that banks are trained to support those disclosures in a way that is trauma-informed.
Thanks, Caroline. Kate, just building on that, can you maybe bring this to life for us a little bit and expand on what this really means for a bank, and in particular a frontline staff member who are having to respond to these kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. So for a team member to be able to respond, obviously the training that we give the team member, being able to identify the situation is really critical. In particular, we know, to Caroline's point, that we know that we're often, one of the first phone calls that a customer can make around their circumstances, and sometimes actually they're not realising they're under financial abuse until they're making the phone call to us. And so for us, it is really critical that our team members are well informed, they care for the customer, but not necessarily carry the burdens. And there's some obviously challenges with that, and making sure our team understand, where we can support, and then how do we lean on amazing external services such as the financial counsellors, as well as some of our other support mechanisms and support services as well. So our team do play a critical role, and we know that any opportunity to talk to a customer about their circumstance in that moment that really matters for the customer can mean the difference between really financial health and stability moving forward, and the ability for us to obviously help them get there is the ultimate it's really relief for us and relief for the customer.
Thanks. Caroline, you've also touched on, and so did Kate, I suppose domestic violence is a touch point for consumers. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the things that banks are actually doing to support customers in this situation, and I suppose the importance of it?
Absolutely. Look, as I say, banks are often the first place that people will go for support. So we find that it's critical to do one of a few things. The first one is to train frontline staff with a basic level of understanding of what it means to support a customer who is disclosing that they're experiencing trauma or family and domestic violence. It doesn't have to be in-depth training, but it has to be trauma-informed training that gives them the ability to be able to support the customer during that interaction. What we often find is that, especially in rural and remote communities, if your movements are being tracked or you're being followed, it's not always safe to go to a community support service. And so a bank is a very agnostic place where you are likely to go in the course of a day that doesn't raise any suspicions with someone who is perpetrating abuse. So people will often go to a branch and disclose their situation to a branch member. So those staff need to be able to understand that they may be the first point, triage point in disclosure. What we absolutely are aware of is that we don't expect our frontline staff to be experts. We expect them to have an understanding and to be trained, but they are not there to solve the customer's underlying situation. They are there to provide appropriate referral pathways to community specialists and organisations, and internal triage as well. So At CBA, we've set up a dedicated family and domestic violence support team. Now, those staff, again, are not social workers, but they are provided in-depth training by community experts, especially where we see the intersectionality between financial abuse and other potential drivers of vulnerability. So we work very closely with organizations in the LGBTQ community, in the First Nations community, to make sure that our staff are trained to support the unique needs of those customers and provide them with culturally safe and appropriate referral pathways. So by partnering with organizations like First Nations Foundation, like Black Card, like 2010, Switchboard, we can ensure that we are providing the right training, the right tools and resources, and then the right referrals to those specialist crisis organizations who can help customers at point of interaction.
Great, thank you. And Louise, I'm just interested in your perspective on this framing of banks as a type of first response, and if you could give your perspective on whether this resonates for you in the context of your work with customers who are experiencing or navigating the support that they need after a natural disaster.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Look, absolutely, I do see the role of a bank very much as taking on that sort of task of being a first responder. And historically, that probably fell to the insurers. The insurers was always a safety net for people for their financial recovery. But as we see more and more insurance becoming unaffordable or indeed not even offered in most high-risk areas, that role of financial recovery is actually falling to the banks. And we know from the work we do in the sector that if you have insurance, the insurance or the bank is the first port of call. It's the first person you're speaking to. And you may often make that call on, day 1, 2, or 3 after the disaster has happened. So they're highly traumatised people. It's no different if they were talking to a psychological first aid worker from Red Cross. They're ringing their bank and they are highly traumatised. And we know that the way that people who engage with impacted residents in that immediacy of a disaster, the way people engage actually has a huge impact on their recovery. And when it's done well, it actually frees up bandwidth for the impacted residents to actually deal with the things that are really important, which is their family, their safety, and their security. But when it's not done well, the long-term impacts are really quite significant. We also know from a lot of research done on mental health that people who are financially stressed have significant mental health concerns, and similarly, people after a disaster can also have significant mental health concerns. And what we now see is that these 2 points sort of collide. And so you're actually dealing with people who have extremely complex trauma in that immediate time. And the other thing, which is a little bit different to what Caroline was speaking about, is these customers are not going to identify as being vulnerable. They're not actually going to pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm a victim of, or I'm a survivor of, or I'm going through. They don't even realise the trauma that they're going through. So the onus is on the bank in that sort of first responder mode to accept that when that call comes in, that person is highly traumatised and needs to be dealt with in an appropriate manner to make sure that there's no further harm done.
Just building on that then, Kate, I want to throw back to you. Can you talk a little bit then, these conversations seem like they're quite sensitive, complex, and also highly specialised. Just interested in the sort of training that you develop and give to your teams to prepare them for identifying and actually responding in these situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have group-wide training that covers off vulnerabilities, particularly about where there is generally a situation of loss, whether it's loss of a loved one, loss of health, loss of income, or in a situation like disaster, generally loss of a house or loss of something that comes with that. And so for us, it is a group response to make sure that it doesn't matter where you've contacted us, that we're able to spot that and get it in through to our specialist teams. Within Assist, the function that I lead, it is about the hardship space that responds to disaster as well as family domestic violence and others, and it's about making sure that the team of specialists that we have are absolutely trauma informed and understand that we often may get one chance to talk to the customer about that scenario and needing to give that level of empathy and care because of the trauma that they've just faced, and we want to make sure that that's the best response we can give and then ultimately the right solution. In terms of training, I do genuinely believe it's something that's going to be ongoing. There is never a perfect level of training. We have to keep going. We do use a number of training partners with us. We're informed by a professor out of Flinders University who helps make sure the language we use to customers is actually, again, trauma-informed and helps the customer feel no level of shame, particularly with the debts that they may be carrying, and that's been really critical. And then we also make sure that we've got training in terms of how does a team member show up for our customers, which is absolutely critical but make sure that when they head home that they're actually showing up with their best selves at home as well. And so for us, that's been a really critical element of getting the balance between absolutely supporting our customers in some of their worst moments, but knowing that actually they can be themselves when they're at home as well. So it's a fine line, but lots to do, and I think going to be a perennial challenge for us to continue to work on that.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Caroline, just interested in whether you want to share some of your insights on this kind of topic as well, around how you're kind of training and supporting and preparing your teams for these kinds of challenging conversations.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, you know, you hit the nail on the head there. It's around continuous training. It's not something that's sort of set and forget. It has to be something that you do on a regular basis, and sort of once a year sort of e-learning module probably doesn't hit the mark, especially with the complexity of the situations that staff are dealing with. So as I say, we do general training for all frontline staff, but then it's really about identifying what our customers' needs are, what they are disclosing to us, what help they need, and then finding the right training providers to ensure that our staff have the skills to be able to support customers during those interactions. So, for example, we work with people like Dementia Australia. We see a huge sort of emerging, risk around customers who have limited decision-making ability or who've lost the capacity to make decisions, and how we support them, especially when they're at risk of things like elder financial abuse. So that's something, that at the moment we're spending a lot of time training our teams on, so that they can understand how to support and interact with customers who may be affected by dementia, and how to provide the appropriate referral pathways to organisations. We also look at our own staff's well-being as well. So while our specialist teams are recruited for those specialist roles, they are not sort of in a frontline role and then asked to take on the role of providing support to customers experiencing traumatic situations like family and domestic violence. We still have to ensure that we provide them with the appropriate support to help them to do their role. So what that could look like is, vicarious trauma training for those team members who have those conversations day in, day out, ensuring that they have the right breaks between phone calls, that they have the ability to be able to debrief, and they work with sort of external EAP providers so that they are getting vicarious trauma training and support themselves, so that at the end of the day, when they go home, they are not unduly impacted by the conversations that they are having with our customers. So I think it's about the training to support the customers, but it's also about the training for staff themselves to be able to continue to do the roles that they do each and every day in working with communities and customers experiencing vulnerability.
Thanks for that. Louise, just building on that, I think just interested in your perspectives on I suppose we've talked about the training and preparation for these sorts of events and circumstances. From your perspective and in the context of weather events, what do you think are the sort of key systems and processes that banks really need to have in place in order that they can respond in a really timely and effective way when they're supporting customers who are experiencing a sort of immediate crisis as a result of, say, a natural disaster?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. I think, look, speed and coordination is really key. It's being out there as soon as you can. And I will say, from my experience, the banks do that really well. They get out there early. They've got, great policies that are generally pre-approved and protocols that are already in place, so they can sort of be stepped up and put into place straight away, and your customers absolutely benefit from that. So that's fantastic. Similarly, strong relationships with other support agencies, which both of you have referred to, is key. And I think also central to that is a warm referral process. Giving a traumatised person a phone number is not going to do anything. They're not going to ring that number. It needs to be a direct referral, so it might be that the bank actually rings the financial counselling sector and says, hey, can you get in touch with this person? We know that they're struggling and they need some overall help, or mental health, or whatever the different support agencies that you engage with and refer on to. I think there are some areas, though, that need to be addressed, and it's really around the long-term recovery. We now know that from disasters that recovery is not 6 months or 12 months. It's easily 2 or 3 years, and we have clients in the financial counselling sector, and they're in year 4 of support after the 2022 floods. And so the policies that are in place for that recovery period really need to meet that timeline. And if I'm honest, I'd say at the moment, most of the policies in place really aren't fit for purpose. And we do get feedback from clients that once a hardship policy has been, agreed with, that sometimes at the end of that period, the client is, or your customer is actually in greater hardship than when they entered into it. And I think that's just because disaster hardship is very different to other forms of hardship. And so it really does need that very specific and identified solution solving for the individual customer to get that best outcome. I also think it would be great if there were just dedicated specialists for disasters. Again, it is just, I think like domestic violence, it's a very unique sort of subset of trauma. And as Paul pointed out yesterday, I think for those of you who were here to listening to that panel presentation, because the recovery process is so long, you might get somebody ringing through to a customer call centre 2 or 3 years after the disaster. It's their first time they're making contact with their bank about the disaster, and to have someone pick up the phone and say, what disaster? It's just not appropriate. And the impacts on that person, again, long term, are really quite devastating. So to have that specialist disaster team where there was a dedicated number so that if you ring that number, you're going to be speaking to somebody that has, as you rightly say, the appropriate trauma-informed practices in place, you're going to get that wraparound support that we know is really important. And they're actually then going to get those best outcomes for your customers, which from what I hear both of you say is that's your goals, that's what the intent is. I just don't think it's hitting the mark at the moment.
Kate, hearing Louise's comments, I'd still be interested in if you could bring to life, I guess, for us in the context of crisis response, the sorts of things that you do have in place to make sure that your teams are ready and prepared to respond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not lost on us, the challenge of responding to a crisis and getting the timing of that response right as well. We have spent a lot of time internally at Westpac talking about the different responses, particularly for disaster, depending on the disaster type. So talking to a customer in a flood where they may need days or weeks or months to deal with the aftermath of that is quite different to a customer that might be having a response to a fire, or a customer that might have had a long-term power outage that's affected their business due to a disaster. And so for us, we have worked through what those responses are, and I agree they can't be fixed and they need to be continually looked at. I think we've got a lot of history, whether it's the floods in Queensland or whatever it is, to be able to understand what's likely to happen. We do have our business plans to make sure that we do have ability to respond from a volume perspective, but I think the care in which we're responding with is laid in regardless of the day of the week and regardless of whether or not we currently have a disaster on foot. We definitely do have a response, particularly relating to disaster, that can go across multiple years, because we do recognise that first phone call is the first of many which may need support. And I think it's not I think it's fair reflection that 3 or 4 years later, some of our customers may not have built up the same financial resilience that they'd had previous to the disaster. So I think whilst the plans are there and we've definitely got lots of learnings, like I mentioned before about training, this is a continuous loop for us in terms of taking the feedback, understanding which disaster we did exceptionally well at, which one we might need to learn from, and obviously take that forward as well.
Thanks, Kate. Louise, I might come back to you because you obviously are here and as someone who has both a sort of personal and professional experience of navigating a crisis, and also how you navigate the various support services that you need to access, including the bank. I'm interested in your perspectives on, and we talked a little bit about processes and systems. I'm actually interested in your perspectives on how you think banks can build greater resilience in these areas, and particularly in relation to, I suppose, their people and culture, and how that translates into the sort of support and meeting the growing expectations on banks.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Look, I think, and I'm going to start by saying I think there needs to be a cultural shift, but by listening to these two lovely ladies, I think the cultural shift is there. But certainly around trauma and understanding that at the core of all of this is trauma. It's very deep trauma, and it's often very complex trauma. Again, we know in disaster areas, typically people there have a much higher rate of mental health concerns. So you have people already going into that situation with perhaps struggling with their own emotional well-being, and then you're layer upon layer upon layer You know, we also know that domestic violence spikes after disasters, elder abuse spikes after disasters. So there's really, it is a really complex area to be dealing with and navigating through. So I think in terms of ways of mitigating and building resilience, I think most people would be familiar with the recovery cycle. So there's a response phase, which is that very early sort of, it might be 3 to 4 weeks up to 3 or 4 months. Then there's a recovery phase, which is much longer, and then there's the preparedness. And I think a lot of work can be done in that preparedness stage, and that was again spoken a little bit about yesterday as well, in terms of educating, partly, you know, your own teams and providing that training and making sure that everybody is adequately prepared to deal appropriately with customers when and if a disaster happens. But it's also educating your customers so that they can be more resilient as well, and be prepared and know where they sit financially. It's also knowing what options may exist. People know when they live in a disaster space. They know where they live if it's an area of high risk. So even that education about if the worst happens, these are the things that we can do to support you. And so people can be prepared and understand. And going in with that sense of strength, I think, again, makes a big difference to that sort of long-term recovery.
Okay. Caroline, having heard that, I'm just interested in, I suppose, initiatives in your teams around this concept of resilience and preparedness for the sorts of conversations and experiences of the customers that are calling your teams.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. We very much think, certainly in the natural disaster space, about that cycle of recovery. And for us, it's trying to understand, A, where our customers are on that cycle, but also how we do a better job of not just being there in the moment, sort of after a crisis has occurred. I think most of the banks have a very strong response, as you mentioned, in that respect. But what happens after the first sort of 3-6 months, when people are still trying to recover financially from the impact of what's happened, and then you add sort of the compounding effect of multiple disasters or adverse weather events, one on top of the other, and it just makes people's ability to be able to recover that much harder. And I think sometimes inadvertently, the systems and processes that are in place compound that trauma and maybe even at times replicate some of those systems of trauma or in DV cases of control that they may experience. So how do we make it really simple for our customers to get help when they need it and that long-term help? So what we've started to think about, certainly at CBA, is, yes, preparedness. So we've done a lot of work over the last year with organizations like Good Shepherd to create tools like a disaster preparedness tool to help customers understand how prepared they would be should they be impacted by a natural disaster. You've got to be a little bit careful because there's sort of a mental block around preparing for anything that might happen, be that a natural disaster, be it family and domestic violence. No one goes into a relationship thinking that relationship is going to fail. No one goes into a relationship thinking that they may experience family and domestic violence. And I think the same is true to an extent for natural disaster. It's very hard to get people to prepare if they haven't been impacted before, because it's a mindset of, oh, it won't happen to me, it's something that happens to somebody else. So how do you talk to people while they are rebuilding, recovering, and help them build resilience when they are in a position to be able to think about it and hear about it? And then how do you help them in the longer term so that they are building that financial resilience and capability in the same way that we already do in family and domestic violence? So I think we do a great job at long-term financial recovery, knowing that for family and domestic violence, that recovery cycle is never circular, right? People go in and out of recovery. It may take 5, 6, 7 times for somebody to leave an abusive relationship. One of those reasons is financial control and financial independence. So how do we help people to rebuild their financial independence so that they're in a position that they are able to leave that relationship once and for all and have the financial resilience and resources to be able to do that safely?
Thanks, Caroline. Kate, I might just touch on this same topic around resilience, but maybe thinking more on your perspectives on internal resilience within the bank to kind of respond and prepare for these sorts of emerging issues. So thinking about from the customer perspective, but how you're also dealing with that internally.
In terms of our own team's resilience, we do spend a lot of time and effort trying to make sure that our teams are ready to catch what the customer is talking to us about. So the conversation that we've just had about caring, not caring for the customer, as I mentioned, is incredibly important to make sure that our team members can show up on behalf of our customers each and every day. We have a particular focus on mental health and wellness, particularly for the teams that are dealing with some of the most traumatic circumstances for our customers, and we've heavily invested in a number of programs, particularly mental health and wellness, and we actually invest in an org psych that's specifically for the team, my team, that look after customers that are in these circumstances, because we genuinely believe that if we've got a team that's ready and mentally capable of looking after our customers, that's the best place we can be. As I mentioned, it's the one opportunity in some ways that the customer will tell us the story in the first instance, and we might have a very, hopefully, longevity of conversation with that customer to make sure they're okay, which means the team members can be in that same journey with the customer along the way as well. So investing in leadership is the other big thing here, making sure that we've got the best leaders that can actually support our team and make sure that they're having great conversations to make sure that that resilience is, really being born each day rather than only in need when a, disaster or an event for a customer happens.
Thanks. I think through this conversation we've talked a lot about the positive things that banks are doing now and all the great work that's really happening. I think what I'd like to move to is a bit of a future forward, and Louise, you've touched on this a little bit, but I'd be interested in if each of you on the panel could maybe think about what you think are the emerging issues and I suppose social risks that banks need to be preparing for and thinking about in this context. I might start with you, Kate.
Perfect. I think the mention earlier around elder abuse is definitely one that we're concerned about and definitely preparing for, and the risk is real that we've got customers that might be under a POA that is being abused, and so for us it's about how do we ensure the detection and then appropriate response where that is detected. I think secondly to that, we've also got amazing technology that's being born, but we just want to make sure that that's actually being used for the benefit of our customers and not for the abuse that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And I think that's a watch out that those emerging technologies are used in the way that they're intended to. And so for us, that continues to be a watch out, as well as housing instability. And that can come through an abuse situation, or it could come through a disaster event. And that is something that we just want to make sure that where we have the ability to make sure we've got eyes on for our customers, that we help and support, but it's definitely one that we want to keep an eye on, and we see it as emerging risk.
Yeah, interesting. Louise?
Thanks, Mel. Look, I think what's interesting is that I think there's a real shift underway at the moment in terms of financial recovery and safety nets for people after a disaster. Again, with insurance just unaffordable or not available, there's a real shift to the banks to take up that role, and I think that will create its own set of issues. How does somebody without insurance rebuild, and how do they rebuild resiliently? There are some, there is government support, but the government support is primarily geared towards the most vulnerable in the community, and there's very strict eligibility criteria to meet those grants. And so, interestingly, what we're seeing in the Mid-North Coast, which was where the last most recent flooding event was, that for the first time more than 50% of homes are uninsured that have been impacted, and many of those people aren't going to be eligible for government grants either. So they're going to be turning to their bank, either if they have a mortgage to actually assist, but if they don't have a mortgage, to help with the repair and rebuild. But I think the complexity comes in is that, and I'm not working in the banking sector anymore, but how do you need those people to be rebuilding resiliently to maintain the value of the asset, and how do you do that when perhaps they can barely afford the increased mortgage to just meet the rebuild itself? So I think there's some issues there, and then around how banks are going to deal with that and actually provide what is going to be an expectation from their customers to assist in that financial recovery. And then there's also, well, what if the insurance is still not available? What is the banking sector going to do? And what are those customers going to do? So I think it's been something which has been on the cards as perhaps this is going to happen, and it's really quite evident from this most recent disaster that we're actually reaching that point now. And with insurance becoming more and more unaffordability, and if you look forward, it looks like there could be in the next 3 or 4 years 30% of homeowners where insurance is just not affordable. It's a big discussion, and it really is something that was emerging, and I actually think it's now here and needs to be addressed.
Thanks, Louise. Caroline?
I think Kate touched on the two that I was probably going to reference as well. So the first is elder financial abuse. As we heard at dinner last night, with an ageing Australian population, it's going to become an ever more prevalent issue. We see, instances of abuse of substitute decision-making instruments like power of attorneys, and that becomes ever more complex when customers may have lost the capacity to either manage or undertake their own banking, and the people who they have appointed in a position of trust are therefore able to take advantage of them financially. Often there is very limited support options in place for those customers, either under the law or that we are able to provide. So I think that's definitely something that we would like to look at in more detail. I think as we shift into a period where we're shifting more and more into digital banking, it becomes harder and harder for our frontline teams to identify signs of things like elder financial abuse, which they used to be able to do during face-to-face interactions in a branch. So changes in spending behavior in your local branch, or perhaps signs that a customer may be looking slightly, disheveled or not looking after their own well-being, or regular customers not showing up, in a branch. So I think there's an increasing risk that it's harder to identify customers who may be at risk of harm. But I also think that digital technology is also able to play a really integral part there at helping us to identify those signs in other ways. So it's around how do we harness the power of technology such as AI to do social good and to understand patterns of behavior before they occur or as they're occurring, and to intercede. And that ties in with the second, which is tech-facilitated abuse. So again, as we rely more and more on digital banking, tech-facilitated abuse becomes more prevalent. In the family and domestic violence space, certainly, we see a lot of it, not just in a monitoring, stalking through digital or technology channels, but also physical safety as well. And I spoke a bit earlier about that interconnectedness between physical safety and financial safety, and we very much see that being the core of the problem around tech-facilitated abuse. So spend notifications being used to track someone's location after they've left, or sending abusive messages through transaction descriptions when you've blocked somebody from being able to contact you via the phone, or using geolocation services or spyware on your phone to be able to track your location. So, again, technology has the power for great good, but we also have to be aware about how bad actors could be utilizing banking and technology services to also put customers at a risk of harm.
Thank you. Before we close off, I'm just going to pick up on something that you mentioned, because you've ended with technology and how it can be used to facilitate harm, and you touched briefly on how technology might be used for good. I'm just wondering if you've got an example of how you might be utilising technology today in your team.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the most well-known use of AI that CBA introduced a couple of years ago was an artificial intelligence model that reviews transaction descriptions. So in a very, very brief description, we identified people using the transaction description fields to send harassing, threatening, and stalking messages to people as a form of communication. That often happens when a perpetrator may have been blocked from contacting a victim via telephone, via social media. You can change your phone number, you can block someone on social media, but you can't stop someone from sending you money unless you actually change your bank account. And so once we became aware of that issue, we looked at how AI could help us to identify transaction descriptions that may be abusive. And there's millions of transactions sent on a regular basis, so it's impossible to manually review all of those descriptions. So we use AI to do that for us, and we've trained a model which is based on an LLM and a number of other AI features to be able to do that in a way that's really effective. And then our specialist teams review those high-risk cases where we're worried about customer safety. And so that's a really different way to think about using AI, still keeping a human in the loop to ensure that we are protecting the safety of people experiencing this form of abuse, but using digital to our advantage.
Thanks. We are just about at time, so thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that you have a sense following this discussion of the really important work that's being done in this space, and also, to pick up the earlier theme, the really important evolving role of banks in society and providing this really critical support. So please take this opportunity to welcome our panel, to thank our panel, and thank you everyone. Thanks everyone.